Fall is when most gardeners put their tools away and call it a season. But that's actually the wrong instinct. The next several weeks, right up until the ground freezes, are when a specific group of perennials root, divide, and establish, easier than at any other point in the year. By next spring, you could be looking at 3, 5, sometimes a dozen plants, where you only had one, and every single one of them free. I'm going through 9 of them today, plants that hold up across most zones in the US and Canada, and I'm starting with the one nurseries actually priced the highest, not because it's hard to find, but because of a rule almost nobody follows correctly. If you've divided a perennial before and watched it sulk, or worse, just die on you, timing was probably the reason. Most division mistakes aren't really about technique. They're about doing the right thing at the wrong point in the plant's calendar. A cutting, or a division taken while a plant is pouring energy into active summer growth, is competing with the plant's own priorities, while the same cutting taken as the plant settles toward dormancy has far less competition for the energy it needs to root. Fall gets that timing right for more plants than people expect, and I want to go through them one at a time so you know exactly why the timing works for each one, instead of just handing you a list and hoping it makes sense on its own. A few of these will overlap with plants you've seen on other propagation videos, but the fall-specific details, the things that actually matter this time of year, are usually left out entirely, and that's the part I want to focus on. Number 1 is peony, Peonia lactiflora, hardy in zones 3 through 8. Here's the rule that trips up more gardeners than any other on this list. Peonies have to be divided in fall, not spring, not summer. If you dig one up in April because that happens to be when you're out in the garden with a shovel and the itch to move things around, you can expect 2 or 3 years of almost no blooms while the plant recovers from being disturbed at the wrong point in its cycle. Peonies spend the growing season building up energy in their roots for next year's flowers, and interrupting that process mid-stride sets the whole plant back. September, once the foliage has started yellowing and dying back on its own, is the window. Cut the foliage down to a few inches above the ground. Dig around the entire clump with a garden fork, staying wide so you don't slice through the roots, and lift the whole thing out. Hose off the soil so you can actually see what you're working with, because peony crowns hide their most important feature under a layer of dirt, the eyes. Those are the small pink or reddish buds sitting right where the old stems meet the root mass, and they're what next year's growth comes from. Miss them under caked-on soil, and you'll cut divisions blind, which is how a lot of gardeners end up with pieces that never sprout. Using a clean, sharp knife, divide the crown into sections, and each division needs 3 to 5 eyes, along with a solid chunk of root attached. Fewer than that, and the new plant will spend years just trying to establish a root system before it even thinks about blooming. Replanting depth is where the second most common mistake happens, and it's arguably more damaging than the first. The eyes should sit no more than an inch or 2 below the soil surface. Bury a peony division deep, the way you'd plant most spring bulbs out of habit, and it may survive for years without ever flowering, because peonies need a certain amount of cold exposure right at the crown to trigger blooming the following spring. A perfectly healthy-looking peony that just refuses to flower, year after year, is almost always a planting depth problem, not a fertilizer problem, no matter what the internet tries to sell you to fix it. A well-established peony clump, the kind that's been sitting undisturbed for 8 or 10 years, can realistically split into 4 to 6 healthy divisions in one afternoon. At retail prices, a single named peony variety regularly runs $25 to $50, sometimes more for the newer intersectional types, so one clump already growing in your yard could represent a couple $100 in nursery value, just waiting on a shovel and an afternoon. Zone matters a little more here than with most plants on this list. Gardeners in Zone 8 and the warmer edges of Zone 7 should divide earlier in fall rather than later, since peonies still need a real cold period over winter to flower well, and pushing division too close to a mild winter's onset gives the roots less time to settle before that chill sets in. I want to set expectations honestly here, because I'd rather you hear it from me than get discouraged next April. New peony divisions often skip blooming entirely their first spring, sometimes their second, while the roots re-establish underground before putting energy toward flowers. That's completely normal, and it's not a sign you did anything wrong. Patience is really the only extra ingredient peonies ask for on top of the timing. One small myth worth clearing up while we're here. Ants crawling on peony buds in spring don't cause the blooms to open, and they're not required for it either. They're just after the sugary residue the buds produce. It doesn't affect division timing or planting depth at all, but it's one of those pieces of garden folklore that gets repeated so often, people start treating it as instruction rather than trivia. Quick question before we move on. Has anyone here actually tried dividing a peony and had it just refuse to bloom afterward for a few years? I'd bet timing or planting depth was the culprit almost every time, and I'd genuinely like to know in the comments whether that matches what happened to you. Number 2 is bearded iris. Iris germanica, hardy in zones 3 through 9. Iris gets divided from rhizomes, thick horizontal roots that sit partly exposed at the soil surface, and fall is one of the better windows for it because the plant finished blooming months ago and has shifted entirely into storing energy for winter rather than pushing new growth that a fall disturbance might set back. Dig up the clump with a garden fork, working carefully around the rhizomes since they snap more easily than you'd expect once they're out of the ground. Once it's lifted, you'll likely see a tangle with older, woodier sections bunched in the middle that have mostly stopped producing flowers, crowded out by younger growth pushing in from the edges. Cut the rhizomes apart with a clean knife, making sure every division keeps at least one healthy fan of leaves and firm, pale root tissue. Here's something genuinely worth checking for while you're doing this, because fall happens to be one of the only times of year it's actually easy to catch. Slice into any rhizome that feels the least bit soft or hollow, and look inside before you toss it aside or, worse, replant it. If you see tunneling or a grub-like larva, that's iris borer, and it does most of its feeding damage over the summer months before overwintering nearby in the soil or old plant debris. Fall division doubles as a free pest inspection, and pulling infested rhizomes out now protects everything else sharing that bed next year. Trim the leaf fans down to about a third of their original height before replanting, which cuts down on how much water the plant loses through its leaves while the roots are busy re-establishing. Plant the rhizome shallow, sitting right at or barely below the soil surface, never buried the way you'd plant a bulb. Iris rhizomes actually want some direct sun exposure on top of the soil, and burying them deep is the single most common reason a perfectly healthy-looking division never produces a bloom the following year. One clump that's been sitting untouched for 4 or 5 years can often produce 6 to 10 separate rhizome divisions in a single session. Space new plantings 12 to 18 inches apart, water them in well right after planting, and then largely leave them alone through the cooler months ahead, since iris genuinely prefers to be left undisturbed once it's settled. One distinction worth knowing if you're growing rebloomers, the varieties bred to flower again in late summer or fall, is that you'll want to divide those a little earlier in the season if possible, so you're not cutting into a plant that's still actively pushing out a second round of flower stalks. Number 3, and this one is about as forgiving as division gets on this entire list, is hardy geranium, sometimes called Cranesbill, at the nursery specifically to avoid confusion with the annual bedding geranium most people picture when they hear the word, which is actually a completely different plant, a pelargonium, not a true geranium at all. Hardy zones typically run 4 through 8, depending on the specific variety, with popular ones like Roseanne and Johnson's Blue showing up in most garden centers across the US and Canada. Cranesbill spreads through a mat of fibrous roots, rather than one single deep taproot, which means you genuinely can divide it by hand in most cases, without any tools beyond a shovel to lift the clump. Dig up a section, and you'll feel it start separating along natural lines, with just a gentle pull. For tougher, older clumps that resist hand separation, a garden fork inserted straight down through the middle and levered apart works fine too. Each division just needs a decent amount of root and a few visible growing points on top. Replant at the same depth it was growing before. Water thoroughly for the first week or two, and that's genuinely most of the process from start to finish. Cranesbill isn't fussy about soil quality and tolerates the kind of partial shade that stops a lot of other flowering perennials from thriving, which makes it a great one to hand off to a nervous first-time propagator, since it's nearly impossible to mess up badly enough to lose the plant. If your Cranesbill has gotten a little leggy by late summer, cutting it back hard after dividing often triggers a fresh flush of both foliage and a light second bloom before frost, which is a nice bonus most people don't expect from a plant they're mainly dividing for free copies. It also tends to get mistaken for a weed by anyone unfamiliar with it when it's young and small, since the foliage looks fairly plain before it fills out. So if you've got a helpful family member who likes to pull things out of garden beds, it might be worth pointing your new divisions out to them directly. This is actually a good spot to pause for a second. If you've made it 3 plants into this list, and you're already mentally walking through your own yard, figuring out which clump you're tackling first, that's exactly the kind of gardener this channel is built for. So go ahead and subscribe now, so the next one of these lands in front of you when you need it. Back to the list, because we've still got 6 more plants to get through, and a couple of them are genuinely surprising. Number 4 brings us to a plant that's almost comically well-timed for this exact video. Autumn Joy Sedum, now more correctly labeled Hylotelephium herbstfreude, on newer plant tags, though you'll see both names used interchangeably at pretty much every garden center. Hardy in zones 3 through 9, and one of the more deer-resistant perennials on this entire list, if that's ever been a problem in your yard. Autumn Joy is blooming right now in most gardens, which is actually the best possible time to divide it, because you can see exactly where each clump sits and exactly how much it's grown compared to last year, without any guessing involved. The roots sit shallow and fairly loose in the soil, and mature clumps genuinely tend to fall apart into natural sections, with barely more effort than pulling them apart by hand once they're out of the ground. Dig around the outer edge of the clump, lift the whole thing, and separate it into pieces that each keep a handful of stems and a fair bit of root attached. Replant immediately at the same depth, water in well, and then resist the urge to keep watering afterward the way you might with a thirstier plant, since sedum roots rot far faster from soggy soil than they ever suffer from being left slightly dry between waterings. A single Autumn Joy clump that's 3 or 4 years old can typically be split into 3 to 5 new plants in one session. Because it's actively blooming as you divide it, you also get to see the flower color and form on every single piece before you even plant it. So there's no guessing what next year's display will actually look like the way there can be with plants divided earlier in the season. Autumn Joy is also one of the better choices if pollinators matter to you in your yard, since the flat flower heads stay attractive to bees and late-season butterflies right up until the first hard frost, which makes a row of new divisions functional as well as decorative. Number 5 is garden phlox. Phlox paniculata, hardy in zones 4 through 8. Phlox has a bit of a reputation problem, mostly thanks to powdery mildew, that white dusty coating that shows up on the leaves by late summer, in crowded, poorly ventilated beds, and makes an otherwise beautiful plant look neglected. Fall division actually helps with this directly, not just as a side effect of general plant health. Dig up the clump once flowering has finished for the season, and separate it into sections with a sharp spade, or by hand if the roots happen to pull apart easily enough on their own. Each division needs a solid clump of roots, and at least a few stems attached. When you replant, space the new divisions noticeably further apart than you might instinctively want to, aiming for at least 18 inches between plants rather than crowding them back together. That extra spacing is really the whole point here. Crowded phlox with poor airflow around the leaves is almost guaranteed to develop mildew again next summer, regardless of which variety you're growing, while divisions planted with real breathing room between them tend to stay noticeably cleaner right through the season. Dividing a mildew-prone clump in fall and giving the pieces proper spacing is, in my experience, a more reliable fix than most of the fungicide sprays people reach for instead, and it costs nothing. Water new divisions well for the first couple of weeks after planting, then let them settle in through the cooler weeks ahead without much fuss. A single overcrowded phlox clump usually yields 3 to 4 solid divisions, sometimes more if it's an older planting that's been left alone for several years. If you've been hesitant to grow phlox at all because of past mildew trouble, this is genuinely the year to give it another shot, since a properly spaced division behaves like an entirely different plant compared to one that's been left to crowd itself for a decade. Newer mildew-resistant varieties exist too, and if you're dividing an older mildew-prone clump anyway, It might be worth replacing one or two of the divisions with a resistant variety instead of replanting all of them, so you can compare the two side by side next summer. Number 6 is Shasta daisy, Leucanthemum times superbum, hardy in zones 4 through 9, with popular varieties like Becky showing up constantly in perennial borders across both countries. It's worth knowing going in that Shasta daisy is a genuinely short-lived perennial without regular division, often declining noticeably after just 3 or 4 years left alone, which makes fall division less of an optional bonus for this one and more of a requirement if you want to keep it in your garden long-term at all. Dig up the entire clump and you'll be able to see the difference clearly once it's out of the ground. Dead or woody material in the middle, surrounded by younger, healthier growth around the perimeter. Discard the dead center entirely and divide the living outer sections into individual pieces, each with roots and a cluster of leaves attached. Replant right away at the same depth and water thoroughly to help the roots settle back in. Deadheading spent blooms through summer, before you even get to division season, also slows down that center die-off somewhat. So if you've been letting the flowers go to seed on the plant all year, that's a small habit worth changing alongside the fall division itself. Shasta daisies genuinely bounce back fast from this kind of division, often blooming close to normal the very next summer, rather than needing a full season to recover the way peonies or iris typically do. One clump can typically be split into 4 to 6 new plants in a single session, and dividing every 2 to 3 years keeps the whole planting fuller and more floriferous than leaving it completely untouched ever would. Shasta daisies also do best in well-drained soil, so if you're splitting a clump from a low spot in the yard that tends to stay damp, it's worth moving at least some of the new divisions somewhere drier, since soggy roots over winter cause far more Shasta daisy losses than cold ever does on its own. Number 7 is Coral Bells, Heuchera, hardy in zones 4 through 9 depending on the cultivar, and grown these days as much for the foliage colors, deep purples, ambers, near black varieties, as for the small flower spikes most people barely notice. If you're gardening somewhere with real freeze-thaw cycles over winter, fall division on coral bells actually solves a problem you might not have connected to propagation at all: frost heave. Older Heuchera clumps develop a raised, woody crown that sits progressively higher out of the soil each year as the plant ages, and that exposed crown is exactly what gets pushed further up and out during repeated winter freezing and thawing, sometimes badly enough to kill the plant outright by the time spring arrives. Dividing the clump in fall and replanting the healthy, actively growing sections at the correct depth resets that problem completely. Separate the crown into pieces, focusing on the outer growing edges rather than the old woody center, which typically won't root well no matter how carefully you handle it. Each division needs a cluster of leaves and a fair amount of root attached. If you're also growing Heucherella, the cross between Heuchera and foamflower that's become common in shade gardens over the last decade, the same fall division approach works on it too, since the two plants share nearly identical root structure. Replant at the correct depth, with the crown sitting right at soil level rather than raised above it, water well, and add a light layer of mulch once temperatures start dropping consistently, which helps prevent that same heaving from affecting your brand new divisions during their very first winter in the ground. A single mature clump can usually be split into 3 to 5 sections. It's not the most dramatic process on this list to watch, but it solves a real, common, recurring problem for coral bells growers, in colder climates specifically, and it's one most people never realize is fixable through division at all. If you're growing several different Heuchera varieties for their foliage colors, dividing in fall also gives you the chance to actually rearrange them, grouping the darker purples together, or spreading the amber and lime varieties out along a border, since you'll have several small plants to work with, instead of just one large clump stuck wherever it was originally planted. Number 8 is Rhubarb, Rhoium rhabarbarum, hardy in zones 3 through 8. I'm including this one because it's easy to forget. Rhubarb is a perennial at all. Most people think of it strictly as a spring vegetable garden crop, something you plant once and harvest from every year, rather than something you'd propagate the same deliberate way you would an ornamental flower. Fall, once the plant has died back naturally for the season, is actually the recommended window for division, right alongside very early spring before growth resumes for the year. Dig up the entire crown, and you'll see it's made up of multiple growing points, sometimes called buds or eyes depending on who's teaching you, clustered together with thick, fleshy roots underneath holding it all together. Using a clean, sharp knife or a spade, cut the crown into sections, making absolutely sure each piece keeps at least one strong bud and a good portion of root attached to support it. Smaller divisions with only a single bud will still establish over time, but they take noticeably longer to produce a real harvestable crop than divisions with 2 or 3 buds each. Replant immediately after dividing, since rhubarb crowns dry out faster than most other perennials on this list, if left exposed to open air for too long, between digging and planting. Set the crown so the buds sit just at or barely below the soil surface, water deeply right after planting, and mulch well going into the colder months ahead. A heavy layer of straw or shredded leaves over the crown for winter matters more for rhubarb than for most of the ornamentals on this list, since exposed crowns in a hard winter without snow cover can suffer real cold damage even in a zone they're technically rated for. A single established rhubarb plant, especially one that's been in the ground 5 years or more, can often be divided into 3 or 4 separate crowns in one session. One important note, if you're doing this specifically for the harvest, and not just to multiply the plant, new divisions need a full growing season to establish before you should pull any stalks at all, so hold off harvesting that first year, even though it's genuinely tempting once you see fresh growth coming up. Given how much a single named rhubarb variety from a specialty grower typically costs, and how many years a well-cared-for rhubarb crown can keep producing reliably, one division session can genuinely set up free rhubarb harvests for a decade or more from a plant you already own. One safety note worth repeating, even though most gardeners already know it: only the stalks are edible. The leaves contain oxalic acid at high enough concentrations to be genuinely harmful, so if you're dividing rhubarb to share with someone new to growing it, that's worth mentioning along with the plant itself. Number 9, and this is the one that earns the word endless in the title more than anything else on this entire list, is Hosta. Hosta species, hardy across an unusually wide range for a single genus, zones 3 through 9, and one of the most reliable plants for filling in shaded areas where almost nothing else wants to grow well. Hostas grow from individual growing points, called eyes, and a mature clump, especially one that's been left completely undisturbed for 6, 8, 10 years or more, can contain dozens of them bundled together underground in one dense mass. If you've got a hosta that's been sitting in the same spot since you moved in, and you've never once thought to touch it, there's a decent chance it already falls into that category without you realizing it. Fall, after the leaves have started dying back but before the ground actually freezes solid, is one of the best times to divide, since the plant is settling into dormancy and won't be stressed by losing its foliage the way it would if you disturbed it in the middle of summer while it's actively growing. Dig up the entire clump, which on an old, large hosta can genuinely be heavy enough to need 2 people or a garden cart, and you'll usually need to hose off the soil to actually see the individual eyes clearly enough to work with them. From there, you can pull sections apart by hand along the natural divisions, or for tightly packed, older clumps, cut straight through the crown with a sharp spade or a serrated knife. Every division needs at least 1 eye and a reasonable amount of root attached, though 2 or 3 eyes per division will establish and fill back in noticeably faster than single eye pieces. This is exactly where hosta pulls ahead of everything else covered today, and it's worth sitting with that number for a second, the way I asked you to earlier with the peony pricing. A single large old clump can realistically be split into 15, 20, sometimes upwards of 30 individual plants in one afternoon, depending entirely on how established the original clump was and how small you're personally willing to go with each piece. Replant at the same depth as before, water thoroughly, and keep the soil consistently moist through the first few weeks, while the roots re-establish before winter sets in for good. Hostas are also remarkably tolerant of rough handling during this whole process, more so than almost anything else covered today, which makes this the plant I'd point a genuinely nervous beginner toward first if everything else on this list has you feeling unsure about where to actually start with a shovel in hand. If slugs have chewed through your hosta leaves all summer, dividing in fall doesn't fix that on its own, but spreading one crowded clump into several smaller plantings across the yard does make it harder for a single slug population to do the same amount of visible damage next season, simply because there's more distance between targets. So that's 9 perennials: peony, bearded iris, cranesbill, autumn joy sedum, garden phlox, Shasta daisy, coral bells, rhubarb, and hosta, every one of them ready to be divided in the exact window we're standing in right now, before the ground locks up for winter. Every single one of them turns into more plants, using nothing you don't already own, and nothing you need to buy. And if you're gardening somewhere, with a shorter fall, further north where hard frost arrives earlier, the general rule across all 9 is to get division done at least 4 to 6 weeks before your average first frost date, giving roots enough time to re-establish before everything goes dormant for winter. I'll be honest about the parts that don't always go perfectly, because I'd rather you hear that from me now than get discouraged the first time it happens to you. Some divisions, especially the smaller ones, will take a full season or 2 before they look like anything close to a mature plant. A few, particularly with peonies and iris, might skip blooming entirely their first spring back while the roots settle in. None of that means you did anything wrong. It just means you took more divisions than the absolute minimum, which is exactly the right call, since a few weaker pieces slowly catching up is a much better outcome than being too cautious and ending up with only 1 or 2 plants from the whole afternoon's work. Before you go, I want an honest answer in the comments. Out of these 9, which one is already sitting in your yard right now without you ever thinking of it as a source of free plants? And which one are you actually digging up this week, while the weather still cooperates and the ground is still workable? Not next spring. Not someday when you get around to it. This week. If this saved you the cost of even 2 or 3 nursery plants, and for most people watching this it probably represents quite a bit more than that once you add up retail prices on peonies and hostas alone, hit subscribe before you head outside, since this channel is built entirely around finding the free plants already growing in your own yard, instead of the ones sitting in a pot with a price tag stapled to it. Share this with whoever in your life keeps saying they want a fuller garden but doesn't want to spend the money to get there, because this is genuinely the answer to that exact complaint, sitting right here in one video. There's one more thing worth saying before you go. None of these 9 plants require anything beyond tools most people already own: a shovel or garden fork, a clean knife, and a hose. There's no rooting hormone required, no greenhouse setup, no special soil mix you need to drive out and buy. That's really the difference between fall division and the cutting-based propagation most gardening content focuses on. Divisions are already established root systems being separated, not new roots being coaxed into existing from nothing, which is exactly why the success rate on everything covered today tends to run a lot higher than people expect going in. Now go take a look at what's actually growing out there, because there's a good chance fall just handed you a free upgrade to next year's entire garden. I'll see you in the next one.